Story lovers, you've arrived at Luxury Tales, where hidden empires collide with forbidden love, and destiny strikes without warning. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because tonight's story is raw, unpredictable, and drenched in secrets money can't hide. Now sit back. Luxury Tales unfolds. Naomi Carter's life looked flawless from the outside, the kind of life that made strangers pause on social media and sigh with envy. She was always impeccably dressed, her posture graceful, her smile carefully trained to appear serene even when exhaustion gnawed at her bones. Married to Daniel Cross, a rising star in the real estate world, Naomi lived in a sprawling glass and steel mansion perched above the city like a throne. But behind the polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows was a marriage that felt colder than winter. Daniel rarely looked at her when he spoke, and when he did, it was as though she were a reflection he tolerated rather than a woman he loved. Conversations were transactional, devoid of affection. Naomi learned to measure her words carefully, knowing the smallest mistake could ignite Daniel's irritation. She spent long nights alone in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling, wondering how love had slowly turned into silence. Daniel's cruelty was never loud. It was precise and surgical. He criticized Naomi's emotions, calling her too sensitive, mocking her quiet attempts to reconnect. But the deepest wound came from his constant reminder that she had not given him a child. Doctors had found nothing wrong with Naomi, yet Daniel clung to the narrative that she was defective. He joked about it at private dinners, his laughter sharp and humiliating, while Naomi forced a smile and swallowed her shame. Each comment chipped away at her dignity, leaving behind a woman who questioned her worth. Naomi still believed marriage was something to be fought for, so she endured, convincing herself that patience might soften Daniel's heart. She did not know that while she was fighting for their union, Daniel had already begun plotting his escape. Unbeknownst to Naomi, another woman was watching her life from a distance, studying it like a chessboard. Vanessa Moore, a brilliant but ruthless public relations expert, had crossed paths with Daniel during a corporate branding consultation. Where Naomi offered loyalty and quiet devotion, Vanessa offered admiration, excitement, and calculated validation. She listened intently to Daniel's complaints about his wife, subtly reinforcing his resentment. Vanessa did not see Naomi as a woman. She saw her as an obstacle, and obstacles, in Vanessa's world, were meant to be removed. The seed of betrayal was planted long before Naomi sensed a shift, long before the first lie was spoken aloud. By the time Naomi noticed the coldness growing sharper, the game had already begun. Daniel's affair with Vanessa did not erupt in passion. It unfolded with strategy. Vanessa knew exactly how to stroke Daniel's ego, praising his ambition and framing Naomi as an anchor holding him back. She whispered promises of a future where he could be admired openly, unburdened by what she called dead weight. Daniel began to repeat her words, as if they were his own thoughts. Each night, he returned home later, inventing meetings and conferences, while Naomi waited with dinner growing cold. When she questioned him, he responded with irritation, accusing her of insecurity. Naomi sensed the distance, but blamed herself, believing she had failed him in some irreversible way. Vanessa's manipulation extended beyond seduction. She encouraged Daniel to see Naomi's kindness as weakness and her silence as guilt. Vanessa planted the idea that Naomi was deliberately preventing him from having a child, that her sadness was a performance meant to trap him. Slowly, Daniel's resentment hardened into cruelty. He stopped pretending. His insults became direct, his disdain open. Naomi found herself apologizing for things she did not understand. Every attempt at reconciliation was met with scorn. She suggested counseling. He laughed. She asked if there was someone else. He denied it with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The final blow came without warning. One evening, Daniel handed Naomi an envelope and told her to read it quietly. Inside were divorce papers, cold, formal, merciless. He informed her that the house was his, the accounts were his, and she had no claim to anything. He accused her of wasting his prime years and called her infertility a curse he could no longer endure. Naomi's legs gave way beneath her, but Daniel did not move to help. Within days, she was escorted out by lawyers and security, carrying only a suitcase of clothes and a shattered sense of self. Vanessa watched from afar, victorious, believing the past had been erased. Naomi, stripped of everything, stepped into the cold night, unaware that this was not the end, but the beginning of her transformation. Homelessness was not something Naomi had ever imagined for herself. She moved from shelters to park benches, her once elegant appearance dulled by exhaustion and hunger. The city that had once applauded her life now ignored her existence. She learned how invisible a person could become when stripped of status. Each night, she replayed her marriage in her mind, wondering how love could collapse so completely without warning. The humiliation haunted her more than the cold. She avoided mirrors, ashamed of the woman she had become, yet still clung to fragments of dignity that refused to die. One winter evening, Naomi collapsed outside a towering high-rise building, her body finally surrendering to weakness. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the city in silence as her breathing grew shallow. Fate intervened in the form of Ethan Cole, a reclusive man known only in elite circles for his wealth and influence. Ethan noticed her crumpled form as he exited his building, something about her stillness unsettling him. Against his instincts to remain detached, he ordered a security team to help her. Naomi drifted in and out of consciousness as she was carried inside, unaware that her life was about to shift in ways she could not imagine. Ethan was no stranger to betrayal. Years earlier, he had trusted the wrong people, resulting in scars that made him wary of human connection. As Naomi recovered in his guest room, he observed her quietly, struck by her humility and resilience. She thanked him repeatedly, embarrassed by her dependence, insisting she would leave as soon as she was able. Ethan saw something rare in her, gratitude without entitlement. Over time, their conversations deepened, revealing shared pain and quiet strength. Naomi found safety in his presence, while Ethan found peace in her honesty. Neither of them knew that the bond forming between them would soon be tested by the harsh glare of the world. As weeks passed, Naomi slowly rebuilt herself within the walls of Ethan's home. She insisted on earning her keep, taking on modest work, and regaining her sense of purpose. Ethan respected her boundaries, offering support without pity. Their relationship evolved organically, grounded in trust rather than need. Naomi learned that Ethan was a powerful figure, though he remained vague about his influence. She sensed he carried responsibilities far heavier than he admitted, yet she did not pry. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a possession, not as a failure, but as a person. Outside their sanctuary, pressure mounted on Ethan to step into the political spotlight. Advisors urged him to consider a presidential run, convinced his integrity could unite a divided nation. Ethan resisted, unwilling to expose Naomi to scrutiny. He feared the world would devour her kindness. But fate intervened when a public protest turned violent, and Naomi, acting without hesitation, saved a child caught in the chaos. Cameras captured the moment, her courage going viral overnight. The nation demanded to know who she was. Vanessa, watching the news, felt her blood run cold. She recognized Naomi immediately. Rage replaced confidence as her carefully constructed life began to unravel. Meanwhile, Daniel's empire showed cracks, his reputation stained by whispers of unethical deals. The past was rising, and none of them could stop it. Naomi stood on the edge of revelation, unaware that her survival had turned her into a symbol and a target. Ethan knew the shadows could no longer protect Naomi. After long, painful conversations, he chose transparency. He married Naomi in a private ceremony, promising to stand beside her regardless of consequence. Their union was quiet but profound, rooted in respect and shared resilience. Naomi, once discarded, found herself loved in a way she had never known. As Ethan prepared to announce his candidacy, Naomi braced herself for public judgment, determined not to shrink again. Vanessa's obsession intensified. Her fabricated pregnancy, designed to trap Daniel, began to fail under scrutiny. Doctors questioned inconsistencies, and Daniel's affection cooled. Desperate, Vanessa fixated on Naomi as the source of her unraveling. She convinced herself that eliminating Naomi would restore control. At a prestigious gala meant to celebrate unity and progress, Vanessa saw her chance. As champagne flowed and cameras flashed, Vanessa slipped poison into Naomi's drink. The act was swift, rehearsed, and cold. Naomi collapsed moments later, panic erupting across the room. What Vanessa did not know was that every corner of the venue was monitored by Ethan's elite security. The truth was captured in high definition, sealing Vanessa's fate. The aftermath was explosive. Vanessa was arrested publicly, her career obliterated in a single night. Daniel's involvement in her scheme surfaced, destroying what remained of his reputation. The nation watched as Ethan revealed Naomi as his wife, silencing every whisper. But the greatest revelation came when doctors confirmed Naomi was pregnant, proof that the cruelty she endured had been built on lies. Naomi's pregnancy became a symbol of vindication. She refused to speak ill of her past, choosing grace over revenge. When Daniel attempted to apologize, broken and desperate, Naomi listened calmly. She told him she had found peace and no longer needed his remorse. Her strength lay not in bitterness, but in release. Months later, Naomi gave birth to a daughter named Grace. As Ethan was inaugurated president, Naomi stood beside him, her head held high. Once abandoned, once broken, she was now a testament to resilience. The nation did not just see a first lady. They saw a survivor. The hospital room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through clear tubes. Naomi Carter lay unconscious, her skin pale against the stark white sheets, her body fighting the remnants of the poison that had nearly stolen her life. Ethan Cole sat beside her bed, his usual composure fractured beyond repair. This was a man who had negotiated with billionaires and stared down enemies without blinking, yet now his hands trembled as he held Naomi's fingers. For the first time in years, fear wrapped tightly around his chest. He replayed the moment she collapsed at the gala again and again, each time imagining a darker ending. The thought that he had almost lost her because of the world he was preparing to step into filled him with quiet rage. Power had always come at a price, but this cost felt unbearable. Doctors moved in and out with guarded optimism, explaining that Naomi had survived because the poison dosage had been interrupted and treated quickly. What none of them knew yet was that her body was protecting more than just herself. Ethan remained at her side through the night, refusing to leave even when aides urged him to rest. Memories of his own past betrayals surfaced, faces of people he once trusted, moments when he learned that ambition could turn love into a weapon. He had sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. Yet Naomi had slipped past every wall he built. Her quiet strength, her refusal to become bitter, had reshaped him in ways he never expected. Watching her now, fragile but alive, he realized how deeply intertwined their fates had become. When Naomi finally opened her eyes, confusion clouded her gaze before recognition softened it. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak, barely a whisper. Ethan leaned closer, assuring her she was safe, that everything was over. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had tried to erase her existence entirely. Yet even in that moment, Naomi felt no desire for vengeance. What she felt was clarity. She had survived abandonment, homelessness, humiliation, and now attempted murder. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she would never again allow herself to be diminished. This was not the end of her suffering, but it was the end of her fear. The investigation unfolded swiftly and publicly, igniting a national firestorm. Surveillance footage from the gala-flooded news networks, leaving no room for doubt. Vanessa Moore was seen clearly slipping the poison into Naomi's drink, her face calm and deliberate, devoid of hesitation. The image shattered any remaining illusion of her polished professionalism. Within hours, she was taken into custody, her arrest broadcast live as reporters crowded the courthouse steps. The woman who once controlled narratives for powerful clients now stood powerless under the weight of her own actions. Her name became synonymous with obsession and cruelty, and every past campaign she had managed came under scrutiny. Daniel Cross watched the fallout from the shadows of his crumbling empire. Investigators traced financial ties, uncovered unethical deals, and exposed the ways he had benefited from Vanessa's manipulation. His former colleagues distanced themselves, sponsors withdrew, and invitations stopped arriving. The man who once believed himself untouchable was now a cautionary tale. Alone in his penthouse apartment, Daniel confronted the truth he had avoided for years, that his downfall was not caused by Naomi's supposed failures, but by his own arrogance and moral decay. The pregnancy scandal involving Vanessa collapsed when medical experts publicly discredited her claims, confirming she had never been pregnant at all. The lie that once bound Daniel to her became the chain that dragged him down. Meanwhile, Naomi's recovery became a quiet symbol of resilience. Messages of support poured in from strangers across the country, women who saw their own pain reflected in her survival. Ethan, advised to keep Naomi hidden for safety, made a different choice. He stood before the nation and acknowledged the truth. Naomi was his wife. He spoke not with political polish, but with raw honesty, condemning violence and obsession while affirming the strength of the woman beside him. The revelation stunned the public. The homeless woman rescued from the snow was now the wife of a man preparing to lead the nation. Naomi listened from her hospital bed, tears streaming as she realized her story no longer belonged only to her. It had become a beacon for others. As Naomi regained her strength, doctors delivered news that shifted the emotional gravity of everything she had endured. She was pregnant. The confirmation came quietly, almost gently, as if the universe itself was offering an apology for the years of cruelty she had survived. Ethan was stunned into silence when he heard the words, his eyes filling with disbelief and joy. For Naomi, the revelation was deeply personal. It dismantled the narrative that had haunted her marriage to Daniel, the lie that she was incapable, broken, incomplete. The truth had always been buried beneath his cruelty, and now it stood undeniable. The public reaction was explosive. Media outlets framed Naomi's pregnancy as poetic justice, a living contradiction to the accusations that once destroyed her life. Yet Naomi refused to let the moment become an instrument of revenge. In interviews, she spoke carefully, emphasizing healing over humiliation. She made it clear that her worth had never been defined by her ability to conceive, and that no woman should be reduced to such a measure. Her words resonated powerfully, sparking conversations far beyond politics. Naomi was no longer just a survivor. She was a voice. Daniel, watching these interviews alone, felt something inside him finally break. Pride dissolved into regret, and regret into despair. Against every instinct, he requested a meeting with Naomi. When they sat across from each other for the first time in years, the contrast was striking. Naomi was calm, grounded, and unafraid. Daniel was hollow, his ambition reduced to ashes. He apologized, awkwardly, desperately, attempting to reclaim a fragment of dignity. Naomi listened without interruption, then gently told him that forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. She had moved forward, and he was part of a chapter that no longer held power over her. Daniel left knowing that the greatest loss was not his career, but the woman he had failed to value. The birth of Naomi's daughter arrived on a quiet morning, bathed in soft sunlight that filtered through hospital windows. She named the child Grace, a testament to the mercy and strength that had carried her through darkness. Holding her newborn in her arms, Naomi felt a profound sense of completion, not because she had become a mother, but because she had survived to choose joy. Ethan stood beside her, overcome with emotion, realizing that the family he once believed impossible had been forged through resilience rather than perfection. As Ethan's presidential inauguration approached, the nation watched Naomi closely. There was no extravagance in her presence, no need to perform. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her when she had nothing. On the day Ethan took the oath of office, Naomi stood beside him, Grace cradled safely in her arms. The crowd erupted not just for a president, but for the woman whose journey embodied endurance. She had walked through humiliation, poverty, betrayal, and violence, and emerged unbroken. Vanessa Moore waited sentencing in a silent cell, her obsession reduced to regret. Daniel Cross faded from public relevance, his name remembered only in cautionary whispers. Naomi, however, stepped into history with her head held high. As the First Lady, she represented more than elegance. She represented survival without bitterness, strength without cruelty, and love without fear. And as a nation looked on, Naomi Carter knew one truth with certainty. Her past no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her story, and nothing could ever take it away. Life after the scandal did not slow down for Naomi Carter. Instead, it intensified in ways she had never imagined. Though her body was still healing from the poisoning and pregnancy complications, the world demanded her presence, her voice, her composure. Every movement she made was now observed, analyzed, and interpreted. Cameras followed her steps. Headlines dissected her expressions, and strangers felt entitled to pieces of her private pain. Naomi learned quickly that survival in public life required a different kind of strength, one rooted not in silence, but in intentional restraint. She refused to let the noise harden her heart. Each morning, she centered herself with quiet routines, reminding herself that dignity was a choice, not a reaction. Ethan Cole struggled privately with guilt. Though Naomi never blamed him, he blamed himself relentlessly. He had brought her into a world where enemies did not fight fair, where power twisted human morality into weapons. Late at night, when Naomi slept beside him, Ethan sat awake, haunted by the image of her collapsing on the gala floor. He promised himself that leadership would not cost him the woman he loved. This internal vow began shaping his political vision, one rooted not in dominance but protection. Naomi noticed a shift in him, the way his speeches softened, how empathy replaced rhetoric. Their marriage was no longer just personal. It was shaping a nation's expectations. Behind prison walls, Vanessa Moore's world shrank to concrete and steel. The silence was unbearable. Without mirrors, without admiration, she was forced to confront herself without distraction. Her thoughts spiraled endlessly, reliving the moment she chose poison over restraint, obsession over reason. She told herself Naomi had stolen everything from her, yet deep down she knew the truth. No one had forced her hand. The world had not betrayed her. She had betrayed herself. The realization was a punishment harsher than any sentence the court could deliver. Naomi's role as First Lady-in-Waiting became more defined as Ethan's campaign transitioned into governance. Advisors encouraged her to curate a perfect image, to soften her story, to hide the uglier chapters. Naomi refused. She insisted that her truth, homelessness, betrayal, and survival, was not a liability, but a mirror for millions. She began quietly meeting with women in shelters, hospitals, and community centers, listening more than she spoke. There were no cameras at first, no announcements. These moments grounded her, reminding her of the woman she once was and the people she could never forget. One evening, after returning from such a visit, Naomi broke down in Ethan's arms. The weight of being strong all the time finally crushed her. She admitted her fear, that she might lose herself again, not to cruelty this time, but to expectation. Ethan listened without interruption, holding her as she cried. He told her something no one else had. She did not owe the world her pain or her perfection. She only owed herself honesty. That night, Naomi slept peacefully for the first time since the gala, reassured that love did not demand performance. Daniel Cross watched Naomi's rise from afar, each public appearance sharpening his regret. He had attempted to rebuild his life quietly, but doors remained closed. Former allies avoided him, and his name carried a stain no apology could erase. He began volunteering anonymously, not for redemption, but to escape his own thoughts. Yet even in humility, he could not undo the past. Naomi's resilience stood as a constant reminder of what it destroyed, not just a marriage, but a woman's sense of safety. Some losses, he finally understood, were permanent. The birth of Grace Cole transformed Naomi in ways even motherhood books could not describe. Holding her daughter, Naomi felt time slow, as if every moment of suffering had led to this fragile, breathing miracle. Grace's tiny fingers curled around Naomi's, grounding her in the present. For the first time in her life, Naomi experienced love without fear of abandonment. She vowed silently that her daughter would grow up knowing her worth, not as a measure of success, but as a certainty. Ethan watched Naomi with grace and felt a deep reverence for the woman she had become. Power no longer intoxicated him. Responsibility did. As president-elect, he faced pressure from all sides, yet every decision filtered through a new lens. He asked himself how policies would affect families like the one Naomi had nearly lost, women without safety nets, people one crisis away from ruin. His leadership style shifted, surprising critics and supporters alike. Compassion, once dismissed as weakness, became his defining strength. Vanessa received news of Grace's birth through a newspaper slid under her cell door. She stared at the headline for a long time, something inside her finally cracking open. The child symbolized everything she could never control. For the first time, Vanessa wept, not from rage, but from grief. She mourned the woman she might have been had she chosen differently. In that moment, she understood that her punishment was not prison. It was living with the knowledge that she had destroyed herself chasing what was never hers. As Inauguration Day approached, threats increased, security tightened, schedules changed, and Naomi's movements were carefully monitored. The memory of the poisoning lingered in everyone's mind. Despite this, Naomi refused to live in fear. She insisted on appearing publicly, on refusing the narrative that violence could silence her. Her calm defiance inspired others, especially women who had been taught to shrink after trauma. Naomi stood tall, not because she felt fearless, but because she chose courage daily. In private, however, anxiety crept in. Naomi worried about Grace growing up in a world that had already tried to destroy her family. She confided these fears to Ethan one quiet evening as they watched their daughter sleep. Ethan reassured her with honesty, not false promises. He acknowledged the danger but reminded her that fear did not get to decide their lives. Together, they agreed to raise Grace with transparency, teaching her strength without paranoia, awareness without bitterness. Daniel attempted one final letter to Naomi, this time without expectation. He thanked her for showing him what integrity looked like, admitting that watching her rebuild herself had forced him to confront his emptiness. Naomi read the letter slowly, then placed it in a drawer. She did not respond. Closure, she had learned, did not require conversation. Sometimes silence was enough. Inauguration morning dawned clear and cold. Naomi dressed simply, refusing excess. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, not because she had changed, but because she had finally become whole. Grace slept peacefully in her arms as aides prepared them for the ceremony. Naomi kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering promises of safety, love, and truth. The crowd was vast, filled with hope, skepticism, and curiosity. When Ethan took the oath, his voice steady, Naomi felt the weight of history pressing gently against her shoulders. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer discarded. She stood not as a trophy, but as a partner. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Naomi focused only on Ethan and Grace. This moment belonged to them. Across the country, people watched Naomi with admiration. Survivors recognized her strength. Mothers recognized her tenderness. And those still struggling recognized her past. She had become more than a first lady. She had become proof that survival could lead to purpose. The early months of Ethan's presidency were demanding, yet Naomi adapted with quiet resolve. She declined ceremonial frivolities, instead dedicating her platform to systemic change. She championed shelters, legal protections for abandoned spouses, and mental health programs for trauma survivors. Critics tried to reduce her to a symbol, but Naomi insisted on substance. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, earning respect not through visibility but through impact. Ethan leaned on Naomi more than any advisor. Her lived experience offered insight no statistic could. She reminded him that policies affected real lives, not abstract numbers. Their partnership deepened, built on mutual trust rather than power imbalance. Their home remained a sanctuary, a place where laughter and exhaustion coexisted peacefully. Vanessa was sentenced quietly. No dramatic outburst, no final statement. She accepted her fate with a numb nod. The weight of her choices finally settled. The world moved on, but the lesson remained. Obsession destroys from the inside out. Grace grew quickly, filling Naomi's life with wonder. Each milestone felt miraculous. Naomi documented moments privately, resisting the urge to turn her daughter into public property. Grace belonged to herself first. Naomi's protectiveness was fierce but balanced. She refused to raise her child in fear's shadows. Daniel relocated, starting anew in obscurity. He watched Ethan's presidency unfold with mixed emotions, regret, humility, and a strange sense of relief. He no longer chased power. That chapter had ended. Naomi, reflecting one evening, realized she no longer defined herself by what she had survived, but by what she was building. Healing had not erased her scars. It had taught her how to live with them. A year after the gala incident, Naomi visited the hospital where she had nearly died. She donated anonymously, leaving behind a note thanking the doctors for giving her a second chance. Walking through the halls, she felt no bitterness, only gratitude. Survival had reshaped her priorities. Ethan announced reforms inspired by Naomi's advocacy, earning bipartisan praise. The nation began to associate leadership with empathy again. Naomi smiled quietly from the sidelines, never seeking credit. Vanessa heard about these changes from within prison walls. For the first time, she felt something close to peace, not because she was forgiven, but because she accepted responsibility. Grace took her first steps in the White House garden, stumbling into Naomi's arms. The moment was unrecorded, unshared, and perfect. Naomi laughed freely, the sound unburdened by history. Ethan watched them, overwhelmed by gratitude. He had gained power, yes, but more importantly, he had gained a family rooted in authenticity. Daniel passed the garden once during a public tour. He saw Naomi and Grace from a distance and turned away, knowing some stories were no longer his to witness. Years later, Naomi stood at a podium, addressing a room filled with women who had survived abandonment, betrayal, and violence. She spoke not as a first lady, but as someone who had been broken and rebuilt. Her voice was calm, unwavering. She told them that survival was not the end. Self-worth was. Ethan watched from the back, pride softening his features. Grace sat beside him, listening intently, absorbing the strength of her mother's words. Naomi ended her speech with a simple truth. No one gets to define you by the worst thing done to you. And as applause filled the room, Naomi Carter knew she had not just reclaimed her life, she had transformed it. I'm glad you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to follow, share, and comment your thought about the story. See you in the next story.